The night was cold, but my blood was boiling. There she was, at the illuminated door of the party, adjusting her dress with a care I no longer recognized. Her eyes swept the parking lot, restless, as if searching for something that should remain hidden. Or rather, someone. It was obvious. There were no more excuses, no more poorly disguised lies. The moment I had been dreading had arrived. I waited in the car for longer than I'd like to admit, holding the folder with the divorce papers that, until that night, I'd prayed I wouldn't have to use. As painful as it was, I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed that confirmation, even if the cost was to shatter what was left of my soul. She picked up her cell phone, typed something quickly, and I knew he was on his way. He had planned every detail, every step, without knowing that I was there, in the dark, watching. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed to echo in the suffocating silence inside the car. The wind ruffled her hair as she looked down the street again. Anxious. Impatient. As if the time between her and her lover was unbearable. I found myself revisiting memories that now seemed bitter. Every smile, every promise made at the altar, the nights we spent together laughing as if the world were ours alone. All of this now crushed by the weight of that betrayal. A betrayal that had been built up in small absences, in smiles that were no longer for me, in touches that had become mechanical. But now, it was all real. Tangible. I got out of the car quietly. The divorce document was in my hand, heavy as if it carried all the pain I had accumulated over years of marriage. She didn't see me until I got close enough for my shadow to cross her field of vision. When she turned around, the shock on her face was all I needed. Her eyes widened as if I were an apparition, a reminder of what she had promised to love and protect. What are you doing here? Her voice came out shaky, full of a nervousness that she couldn't disguise. I came to finish what you started. I held out the papers towards her, feeling each word weigh like a sentence. Here it is. The end. She stuttered, took a step back, but there was nowhere to run. Her eyes alternated between mine and the envelope as if she expected me to be joking. What? No. It's not what you think. Please, let me explain. Explain what? My voice came out low, but full of restrained anger. That you left our house early to meet him. That while I believed everything was returning to normal, you were planning it. Do you really think there's anything to explain? She shook her head frantically, but the silence around us seemed to shout out all the truths she was trying to hide. I felt the weight of the night in every unspoken word, in every tear she struggled to hold back. But there was no turning back. The sound of footsteps on the asphalt made her turn quickly, and there he was. The man she had chosen to put between us. Dressed impeccably, but carrying an expression of surprise that soon turned to something darker when he saw me. He stopped, confused, not knowing whether to continue or turn around. You must be him. My words cut through the air like a blade. The reason everything we built was destroyed. I don't know what you're talking about. He tried to disguise it, but guilt was written in every hesitant movement. Oh, yes, you do. My gaze returned to her, who now looked small, fragile, as if the lies she had told had sucked all the strength out of her. And that's what hurts the most. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The silence that followed was unbearable. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. He took a step back, realizing that there was nothing he could say to ease the weight of that night. I handed her the envelope and, for a moment, our fingers touched. It was the emptiest touch I've ever felt. I loved her. God knows how much I loved her. But in that instant, I realized that love also has limits, and hers had been broken long before I got there. I turned around and started walking back to the car. Behind me, I heard her voice, desperate, trying to reach me. Please listen to me. It's not what it looks like. But it was. It always was. I knew that. She knew that. And soon, he too would know that what begins with lies never ends well. The car pulled away, leaving them behind, but the story was far from over. I knew that night was just the beginning. A beginning that would seal not only their fate, but also mine. After all, when everything is destroyed, what's left to rebuild? And in the midst of all this pain, there was one question I couldn't get out of my head: what led someone I blindly trusted to betray not only my love, but also the future we dreamed of together? The answer, I knew, was yet to come. And when it came, it would change everything. Welcome to the channel where we reveal the devastating impacts of betrayal. Here, we don't support, justify or romanticize infidelity. All the stories are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and dreams. Get ready for a journey full of intense emotions and profound lessons. Now, settle in and be ready to listen to a story that will shock you and hold your attention until the very last second. Good story. James and Laura were what many would call the perfect couple. From their first meeting years ago, there seemed to be a connection that defied time and challenges. He was a methodical, practical man, someone who saw beauty in order and predictability. With a solid career as a civil engineer, James had always prioritized stability and security. Laura, on the other hand, brought the perfect balance to his life. Creative, outgoing and with an eye for the small beauties of everyday life, she found joy in details that often escaped others. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a house that seemed to be the physical manifestation of mutual care. Every choice, from the color of the walls to the cozy furniture, reflected the joint effort to turn a space into a home. The garden, always immaculate, was Laura's special project, as she spent hours there, planting flowers that gave a lively and colorful touch to the gray winter mornings. Their marriage was based on routines that, for many, might seem boring, but for them they were comforting. There was something special about knowing that every Friday night they would share a pizza while watching old movies. Or that on Sundays they would go to the local market together, discussing which wine would go best with dinner. These little traditions weren't just habits, they were the foundations of a love that seemed indestructible. However, as with all couples, time brought changes. James, always so dedicated to work, had started to spend more hours in the office, motivated by projects that he believed would guarantee a comfortable future. Laura, for her part, immersed herself in her passion for art, something James had always supported, but which, lately, seemed to have become a refuge for her. As the subtle distance between them grew, they both attributed it to the natural pressures of adult life. Laura had an undeniable charm. She was the kind of person who captivated easily, with a warm smile and an infectious laugh. Always involved in the city's cultural events, she was known for her strong presence at art exhibitions and community fairs. James, on the other hand, was more reserved, preferring to observe the world around him with a contemplative calm. He was proud of Laura's independence, although he sometimes felt a twinge of insecurity when he realized how much she shone in environments he would never master. There was a delicate balance between them, but also a vulnerability that they both avoided facing directly. Laura missed the moments when James seemed more present, more connected to what she was saying. James, on the other hand, although he rarely admitted it, was beginning to question whether he was being enough for a woman as vibrant as Laura. These doubts, never verbalized, created small emotional chasms that were filled with silence. One afternoon, while Laura was tidying up her studio at the back of the house, she found a note that James had left her months before. It was a simple message, but full of meaning: "You're the reason everything is worth it." She held the paper for a few seconds, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. The gesture was typical of James, always discreet in showing his feelings, but deeply sincere. She wanted to believe that those words were still true, but something inside her hesitated. Across town, James was in an endless meeting, trying to reconcile tight deadlines and client demands. His thoughts, however, were not completely there. He remembered the last time Laura had surprised him with one of her works of art, a painting that captured the sunrise in such a unique way that he was moved to tears when he saw it. He knew he had to find a way to repay her for that gesture, to show her that, despite the rush, she was still his priority. In the weeks that followed, they both made efforts to get closer. James started coming home earlier, putting work aside to spend time with Laura. She, in turn, began to include James in her trips to cultural events, introducing him to a world he had previously only known from a distance. But despite these attempts, there was an underlying tension that neither of them could fully identify. On one such evening, while they were having dinner at Laura's favorite restaurant, she mentioned an invitation she had received to exhibit some of her work in a local gallery. James smiled, genuinely proud, and encouraged her to accept. "You deserve it, Laura. I always knew your talent would go beyond our circle." She thanked him, touched by his support, but something in his gaze seemed distant, as if he were only physically present. The daily routine went on as usual, but small details began to slip through the cracks. James forgot to call Laura during the day, something he used to do religiously. Laura, for her part, seemed more distracted, with messages on her cell phone that she quickly closed when James entered the room. They were seemingly insignificant gestures, but together they formed a pattern that they both chose to ignore. One morning, while they were having coffee, James noticed that Laura was quieter than usual. "Is everything all right?" he asked, trying to decipher what was going on. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I'm just thinking about the exhibition. It's a big step." He held her hand, trying to convey confidence. "You'll shine, as always." Still, the feeling that something was out of place persisted. They both felt it, but neither had the courage to verbalize it. After all, admitting that there was a rift in the relationship would mean facing issues that could change everything. Meanwhile, preparations for Laura's exhibition were progressing. She spent hours in her studio, creating pieces that expressed her deepest emotions. James, for his part, immersed himself in his work, believing that by guaranteeing a stable future, he was fulfilling his role as a husband. But in the midst of these individual efforts, the connection they shared continued to fray. What had begun as a small distance now seemed like an abyss. But still, there was love. There were memories that kept them together, moments that they both treasured and that gave them hope that they could overcome any obstacle. James and Laura's world was a precarious balance between what was and what could be. And as they continued to walk in parallel directions, the inevitable drew closer, hidden in the shadows of their own choices and silences. Laura was adjusting the last details of her exhibition with an enthusiasm that James hadn't seen for a long time. The gallery was full of vibrant paintings, each telling a story of emotion, pain and hope. While she instructed the staff on the lighting and arrangement of the pieces, James stood in the background, watching with silent admiration. He knew how much it meant to her, but he also felt increasingly disconnected from that world that wasn't his. The days leading up to the opening were a whirlwind of commitments. Laura was constantly busy with meetings, interviews and final adjustments. James, on the other hand, was trying to find ways to support her without invading her space. He prepared a special dinner one evening, but she arrived too late, too exhausted to eat. He left affectionate notes around the house, but he wasn't sure if she even noticed them. Little by little, she began to feel invisible, like a presence that no longer made a difference. Laura was also dealing with her own internal conflicts. Although she was happy with her professional recognition, she couldn't ignore the emptiness she felt in her marriage. James' gaze, always so warm, now seemed distant. As much as she tried to convince herself that it was just the stress of the last few months, there was something deeper there, something she was afraid to face. On the night of the opening, the gallery was packed. Friends, collectors and art critics filled the space with praise and enthusiasm. Laura was the center of attention, and James couldn't have been prouder. However, as he watched his wife shine, he couldn't help but notice something that escaped him, a man who always seemed too close, smiling in a way that made James uneasy. At the end of the event, James approached Laura, who was chatting animatedly with the same man. He held out his hand politely, but something about the other man's firm grip seemed forced, almost defiant. Laura introduced him as Mark, an art curator who had helped her with the exhibition. The conversation flowed politely, but James couldn't shake a nagging feeling, something that seemed to scream in his mind, even without concrete proof. The following week, James tried to put his fears aside. Laura was busy with the success of the exhibition, and he wanted to support her. He decided to surprise her one afternoon by leaving work early and stopping by her favorite coffee shop to buy the coffee she loved so much. But when he arrived at the studio, he saw something that made him stop at the door. Laura wasn't alone. Mark was there, leaning over a canvas while Laura explained something, laughing in a relaxed way. It was an apparently innocent scene, but the closeness between the two ignited something inside James. He didn't go in. He stood there for a few minutes, observing Laura's gestures, the way Mark seemed comfortable in that space that he had always considered a sanctuary for the couple. When he finally decided to leave, he felt a tightness in his chest, an anguish he couldn't explain. The following days were marked by a growing silence between James and Laura. He tried to act normally, but his thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. Questions ran through his mind: was he being paranoid? Was he inventing something where there was nothing? Or, worse, was he ignoring clear signs that something was wrong? Laura, for her part, felt the tension growing. James seemed more distant than ever, and she didn't know how to break through the invisible barrier that separated them. She tried to start conversations, to suggest going out together, but he always found an excuse. She felt guilty for something she couldn't name, as if the mere fact that Mark was present in her life was already a transgression. Everything changed one Friday night. James, determined to understand what was going on, came home early after leaving for a meeting with colleagues at work. He parked the car some distance away and walked up to the door. The lights were on, but the house was strangely silent. When he entered, he called out for Laura, but there was no answer. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing in his mind like a harbinger of something inevitable. When he opened the bedroom door, James' world collapsed. Laura was there, but she wasn't alone. Mark, sitting on the bed, looked as surprised as she was. For what seemed like an eternity, no one said a word. James looked at Laura, waiting for her to say something, anything to explain the scene. But all she managed was to stammer out, "It's not what it looks like," a phrase that sounded empty and unconvincing. The anger James felt at that moment wasn't explosive, it was cold, methodical. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He just looked at Laura with a silent pain that said more than any words could. "I just wanted to understand why," he finally said, his voice low and trembling. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you try to fix what we had?" Laura began to cry, but James didn't stay to listen. He went downstairs, grabbed his car keys and left, leaving the door open behind him. On the way, the anger was replaced by an overwhelming sadness. He drove aimlessly, trying to process what he had just seen. The image of Laura and Mark together seemed etched in his mind, replaying like a horror movie he couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Laura remained in the room, tears streaming down her face. Mark tried to say something, but she interrupted him, saying that she needed to be alone. He left, leaving her there, alone with her choices and their consequences. James, for his part, stopped the car in an empty parking lot and sat for hours, staring at nothing. He knew that his life would never be the same, but what he didn't yet know was that this moment was just the beginning of a chain of revelations that would change everything. The silence was heavy that morning. James was sitting at the kitchen table, his coffee cooling in front of him. The events of the night before were still fresh in his mind, an open wound that throbbed in every thought. Laura came down the stairs slowly, her face downcast. She tried to start a conversation, but her voice sounded as fragile as the state of their marriage. "We need to talk," she said, pausing in the kitchen doorway, as if she feared crossing the invisible barrier that seemed to separate them. James looked up at her, and the weight in his gaze was unbearable. Talk. He finally broke the silence with a bitter laugh. What's there to talk about, Laura? What's left to say after everything I've seen? She pulled up a chair, hesitating before sitting down. I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you in a way that I may never be able to fix. But please, just listen to me. James crossed his arms, indicating that he was willing to listen, but not to make things easy for her. Laura took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but the weight of the moment seemed to overwhelm her. I never wanted this to happen, she began, her voice shaking. When I met Mark, it was just work, a professional collaboration. But over time, I can't explain it, James, it was as if something in me was empty. Empty. He repeated, his voice laden with incredulity and repressed anger. And instead of talking to me, you decided to fill that emptiness with him. I tried, she retorted, tears flowing. I tried to get closer, I tried to bring you back. But you were always distant, always focused on work, on the future. I felt alone. James shook his head in frustration. And you think I didn't feel alone too? Do you think I didn't realize how much we were drifting apart? But unlike you, I didn't look for someone else. The silence that followed was even more suffocating. Laura looked at him, her eyes begging for some spark of understanding, but James looked away, unable to face her. Is there anything else I should know? He asked, his voice cold. Because, honestly, I don't think I can be surprised anymore. Laura hesitated, biting her lower lip. The tension in the air was palpable. Finally, she decided to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. James, there's something you need to know. Something that could change everything. He frowned, leaning forward slightly. What do you mean, Laura? What other secret have you been keeping? It's not about Mark, she began, choking on her words. It's about his work, and the impact it's had, on our lives. James remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Laura seemed to be gathering all the courage she had. When she finally spoke, her words cut through the air like knives. Mark works as a curator, but before that he was also involved in investigations for an important client. That's how we met. James, he knew something, about you. Something that made me question everything. James blinked, confused. What are you implying? Laura picked up an envelope she had left on the table and slid it towards him. James took it hesitantly, feeling the symbolic weight of the object. Opening it, he found papers, photos and a name he immediately recognized, one of his company's clients. This doesn't make sense, he said, examining the documents. What does this have to do with me? With us? Laura rubbed her hands together nervously. Months ago, Mark said he was investigating a possible fraud involving a client of yours, someone who was using your company's name to launder money. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it. But then, he showed proof. James felt the ground open up under his feet. Evidence. What kind of proof? Did you really believe him? Did you believe that I would be involved in something like this? No, it wasn't that. Laura exclaimed in despair. I didn't think you knew. But I started to doubt everything. About us. The reasons why you were so distant. He threw the papers on the table, his eyes blazing with anger. So that's it. You let someone into our lives, into our marriage, because you decided I was guilty of something that doesn't even make sense. Laura tried to hold his hand, but he pushed her away. James, I was confused. I love you, but I was confused. He said things that made it seem like you were hiding something from me. I felt betrayed before I even found out if it was true or not. James stood up, his chair creaking under the weight of his indignation. And instead of asking me, confronting me, you chose to trust him? Chose to betray him to me? Laura's tears were falling freely now. I made a mistake. I know I was wrong. But please, look at the documents. If there's something wrong, we need to sort it out. Together. James looked at her, feeling overwhelmed by a mixture of anger, sadness, and despair. He picked up the papers again, looking at them more closely. The information seemed consistent, but something still didn't make sense. Why would he do that? Why involve you? James asked, his voice now laden with suspicion. Laura hesitated before answering, her voice almost inaudible. Because he wanted to destroy you, James. He used me to get to you. The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that seemed unbearable. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. Everything he had believed to be true was now in question, and he didn't know who to trust, not even the woman he loved. He stared at Laura for a long moment before speaking. If that's true, you've not only destroyed what we had, but you've also put me in the middle of something that could ruin everything I've worked for. I don't know if I can forgive that. Laura sobbed, trying to find something, anything, she could say to repair the damage. But she knew that, at that moment, words wouldn't be enough. James took the documents, put them back in the envelope and started walking towards the door. I'm going to find out the truth, he said, with a tone of voice that mixed determination and exhaustion. And when I know, I'll decide what to do with it. And with us. Laura stood there, alone, feeling the weight of her choices fall on her like a suffocating blanket. She knew she had reached the point of no return, and that the truth James would discover could change not only their marriage, but the whole life they had built. James drove through the city aimlessly, the envelope next to him on the seat seemed to pulsate, as if it had a life of its own. The weight of what he had just discovered consumed him, but he knew he couldn't allow himself to act impulsively. He needed answers, and they wouldn't come from Laura. Not now. When he stopped in front of a small bar in the center, James hesitated before entering. He wasn't the kind of man to seek solace in a drink, but that night seemed to require something to numb the confusion in his mind. Sitting at the bar with an untouched glass of whiskey, he observed the movement around him. Everything seemed so normal, so far removed from the chaos he was experiencing. He ran his fingers over the envelope again, as if the simple act of touching it could provide the answers he was looking for. Decided, he got up and left. He knew where he needed to go. Mark's house was the next step. No matter the time or the circumstances, he needed to confront the man who had manipulated his wife and apparently plotted against him. The car glided through the empty streets until it was parked in front of a modern building. The lights were on, and James took a deep breath before getting out of the car. When Mark opened the door, he had an expression of surprise that quickly turned into a mask of calm. "James," he said, crossing his arms on the doorframe. "I wasn't expecting a visit from you." "We need to talk," James replied, forcing himself to keep his voice under control. Mark took a step to the side, beckoning him in. The interior of the house was spotless, almost sterile, as if nothing had been touched. James, however, wasn't interested in the decor. "Do you think you can play with my life?" he began, holding the envelope in the air like evidence of a crime. "Use my wife, my marriage, for your own agenda?" Mark remained silent for a moment, appraising James with an almost curious gaze. "I knew you'd find out eventually," he said, calmly. "But you're asking the wrong questions." "Wrong?" James practically spat out the word. "You've destroyed my trust, my marriage. And you still think I don't know enough?" Mark took a step closer, his gaze cold. "James, your marriage was already cracked. I just accelerated the process. As for the rest," he gestured to the envelope, "I'm not the one using your company. There are things you need to know. And you might not like what you find out." James narrowed his eyes, his body tense. "What are you implying now? That I'm guilty of something without even knowing it?" Mark smiled, a gesture that seemed more like triumph than an attempt at comfort. "Maybe not directly. But look around you. How much time have you spent at work, blindly trusting the people around you? Do you really know who's next to you? James stared at him, each word penetrating deep. He hated himself for knowing there was truth there. He had neglected important aspects of his life in search of a comfortable future, and now it seemed that the cost of that neglect was taking its toll. I want names. I want proof. If you have anything against me, against my company, say it now, James demanded, his voice firmer than he felt inside. Mark went to a drawer, took out another envelope and handed it over. Here's everything you need. And before you ask, this isn't blackmail. Consider this an opportunity to make things right. James grabbed the envelope, every fiber of his being telling him to get out of there before his anger overwhelmed him. When he reached his car, he hurriedly opened the envelope. The documents there detailed suspicious transactions linked to one of James' longtime associates, someone he considered a friend. The evidence was clear, and the betrayal seemed far greater than he had imagined. It wasn't just Laura. It wasn't just Mark. It was his whole world falling apart at once. That night, James didn't go home. He drove to a hotel and spent hours going through the documents, trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that seemed endless. Meanwhile, Laura sat on the sofa in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for him to come back. Guilt consumed her, and every second without news of him seemed like a sentence. When the sun finally rose, James made a decision. He needed to confront the partner who repeatedly appeared on Mark's papers. He needed to look into the eyes of the person who had broken his trust in the business world. He drove straight to the office, and even though it was early, he found the man sitting at his desk. "James, what are you doing here so early?" said the partner, getting up to greet him. But the look on James' face made him stop. "You know why I'm here," replied James, placing the envelope on the table. "I want you to look me in the eye and tell me this isn't true." The man hesitated, and the silence that followed was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with nervousness. "James, you weren't supposed to find out like that." "So it's true," said James, his voice low but deadly. "You used our company for that? To get rich at my expense? At the expense of our staff, our families?" It was a mistake, the man began to justify, but James interrupted him. "No. It was a choice. Just like everything that's been happening around me lately. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences." James left the office feeling clearer than ever. For the first time in months, he knew exactly what he needed to do. But even so, the pain of everything that had happened was still there, weighing on him like a shadow. He returned home that evening, determined to confront Laura for the last time. When he opened the door, she ran to him, tears in her eyes. "James, please say something. Anything." He stared at her, exhausted. "I've discovered the truth, Laura. Not just about you and Mark, but about everything. And now, I need to decide if there's anything here worth saving." Laura fell to her knees, begging for forgiveness, but James just stood there, looking at her, as if trying to recognize the woman he had once loved. James was standing in the living room, his hands still clutching the papers that had become the epicenter of his new reality. Laura, kneeling in front of him, was sobbing softly. There were no more words between them at that moment, only the palpable tension that filled the space. He looked away, staring into the void, as if the solution to the chaos could emerge from the silence. Laura finally broke the stillness, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to ask you for forgiveness. I don't know how to fix this," he interrupted her, his voice cold but laden with weariness. "Maybe because there is no fixing it, Laura. Maybe because some things, once broken, simply can't be restored." She shuddered at the weight of his words, but insisted. "I made a mistake, James, I know that. But Mark, he manipulated me, he knew exactly how to get to me, how to make me doubt you, us. I don't know what I became in the middle of it, but I never wanted us to get here." James ran a hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. There was a deep weariness in his expression, something Laura had never seen before. And yet you allowed it to happen. Not just the betrayal, but everything that came before. You let him plant doubts, invade what was ours. And now none of it makes sense. Laura stood up slowly, trying to get closer to him, but James backed away, creating a space that seemed insurmountable. Do you think you can just say that you've been manipulated and hope that that will solve everything? That it erases what I saw, what I felt? She shook her head helplessly. No. I know it won't. But, James, I want to try. I want to try to repair what I've destroyed. He let out a bitter laugh, looking away. You want to repair it? Laura, do you understand what has been taken from me? My confidence, my peace, my life as I knew it. It's not something you can repair with words. She remained silent, her tears flowing as he crossed the room, picking up his keys. Before leaving, he stopped at the door, without turning around. I need time. I need to figure out what to do with all this. Don't look for me. James drove off, leaving Laura alone, the weight of her choices now more evident than ever. He drove aimlessly, his hands gripping the steering wheel as his thoughts ran wild. Every detail, every conversation, every moment shared with Laura now seemed tainted, as if nothing had ever been real. He stopped in a little traveled park, parking under the shade of a tree. The wind swayed the branches above him, a sound that should have been reassuring but only reinforced his loneliness. He closed his eyes, trying to find a clarity that always seemed to slip away. Mark's words came back into his mind, blending with Laura's. He knew there was a greater truth hidden there. He knew there was a greater truth hidden there, something he still didn't fully understand. The betrayal was real, but there seemed to be something deeper, something he needed to uncover in order to finally find peace. The next few days were a blur. James threw himself into his work, avoiding thinking about Laura, avoiding thinking about everything. But Mark's envelope was still there, on the corner of his desk, as a constant reminder that he couldn't run away forever. Finally, on a silent night, he opened the documents again, examining every detail more carefully. One particular line caught his eye. A name he knew well, linked to a suspicious transaction. It wasn't just the partner he had confronted before. There were other people involved, people he would never have imagined. The web was wider, more intricate than he could have foreseen. Determined, he scheduled a meeting with the company's board. He could no longer ignore the problem, even if it meant exposing himself and the company to scrutiny that could destroy his reputation. When he entered the meeting room, all eyes were on him. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I need to be honest with you all, he began, his voice firm. There is evidence that the company was used in illegal activities. And although I didn't take part in it directly, I take responsibility for not having paid attention to the signs. The silence in the room was absolute, until one of the board members spoke up. James, this is very serious. If what you're saying is true, there could be legal consequences. I know, he replied, without hesitation. And that's why I'm bringing this up now. We need to put this right before it becomes irreparable. As the meeting continued, James felt a weight being lifted. He still didn't know how he would deal with the ramifications of this in his personal life, but at least at work, he was taking charge again. When he returned home that evening, he found Laura waiting on the porch. She looked dejected, as if the time away from him had been even crueler than it had been for him. James parked the car, but sat for a moment, watching her. Finally, he got out and approached her slowly. Why are you here? He asked, his voice calm but distant. I needed to see you, she replied, her voice full of emotion. I needed to tell you that, no matter what happens, I'm sorry. Not for what I lost, but for what I made you lose. James stared at her, fighting the confusion of feelings that the sight of her aroused. Part of him wanted to push her away, while another part wanted to believe that there was still something to be saved. Laura, he began, choosing his words carefully, "I don't know if I can forgive you." "Not yet. Maybe never." She nodded, accepting the words with what dignity remained. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that, no matter where this takes us, I still love you." James didn't reply. He just looked at her for a few more seconds before entering the house, leaving her behind once again. As he closed the door, he knew he still didn't have all the answers. But he knew that the end of this story was yet to be written. James was sitting in the conference room of a courthouse, waiting for the moment when everything would finally be resolved. The atmosphere was cold, impersonal, but the tension in the air was almost suffocating. He had spent months preparing every detail, reviewing documents, testimonies and evidence. He knew that, after that day, his life would never be the same. Laura's betrayal, the scam at his company, the difficult choices he had to make, everything had culminated in that moment. Laura entered the courtroom accompanied by her lawyer. She was thinner, paler, with deep-set eyes that showed she'd had a bad night's sleep. Although they hadn't spoken since their last confrontation, she knew that this was the decisive moment, the final point in a painful chapter of their lives. When the session began, James presented his side of the case against the partner who had betrayed his trust. He laid out every detail of the money laundering scheme, showing how the partner's actions had jeopardized not only the company, but also the stability of countless families who depended on it. During his testimony, James felt anger mix with a sense of justice. He wasn't there just to punish, but to put right what had been broken. The partner tried to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, he was found guilty, and James felt an immediate sense of relief. There was still a lot to rebuild, but for the first time in months, he felt in control of his life again. After the session, Laura met him in the hallway. She called him by name, her voice hesitant but charged with emotion. He stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. "James," she began, approaching him cautiously. "I just wanted to say that I'm happy for you. For finding the truth. You deserve it." He finally looked at her, his gaze calmer but still distant. "Laura, knowing the truth doesn't give me back what I've lost. But at least I can move on." She nodded, realizing that these were probably the last words they would ever exchange. There was something final in that exchange, a silent acceptance that the love they had once shared would not survive the scars left by their choices. As James left the courtroom, he felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for what he had lost, but relief for knowing that he could finally start again. He devoted the next few months to rebuilding his company, restoring the trust of his employees and clients. Work became a refuge, but also a symbol of his determination to move forward. Laura, for her part, moved away completely. She sold the house they had lived in together and moved to a small town, where she tried to restart her life away from the past. Although she hoped that one day she would be forgiven, she knew that this was not something she could demand of James. She immersed herself in her art, creating works that reflected her pain, her regret and her attempt at redemption. The paintings were well received, but for her they were more a way of dealing with her own ghosts than a professional goal. Months later, during a business trip, James met someone unexpected. Emily was a consultant hired to help with a new company project. She was different from Laura in many ways, practical, direct, but with a sensitivity that captivated him. They started talking during breaks in meetings, and gradually something more emerged. James felt something he thought he would never experience again, hope. Although hesitant at first, he allowed Emily into his life. Over time, he realized that he was not only rebuilding his career, but also his ability to trust, to love again. Emily wasn't a replacement for Laura, she was someone with whom he could start something new, without the burdens of the past. Meanwhile, Mark faced the consequences of his actions. After the revelation of his involvement in the scam and his manipulation of Laura, he lost his position at the gallery and was discredited in the art world. Without the trust he had built up over years of work, he saw his career crumble. Ironic, he thought, how his ambition had led him to lose everything. James, now stronger and wiser, knew that his journey was not over. The past still haunted him in silent moments, but he had learned not to let it define him. He looked to the future with determination, knowing that the painful lessons of the past had shaped him, but not destroyed him. If you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave a comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, always reflecting on how our choices shape our lives. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Each story is a reminder of how our actions have profound consequences. See you next time.